Good morning, everybody. Welcome in. I have a couple people slowly trickling in, so we'll give it a few seconds. You guys just want to go ahead and drop in the chat where you're logging in from and your title. We'd appreciate it. Okay, looks like we have everybody in. Perfect. The chat so everyone that is coming in can go ahead and tell us where you're logging in from. Welcome in, everyone. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. It looks like we have quite a few people in our webinar right now. So thank you and welcome to our webinar devoted to a topic that our presenters, as well as Collaborative Learning Solutions, are very excited to share with you. For today's webinar, we will focus on 5 critical factors that districts miss when designing an MTSS process. My name is Dawn, and I will be your moderator today. I'll be behind the scenes supporting the presenters with monitoring the chat and any tech issues that may arise. Now, to share a little bit about our company. Collaborative Learning Solutions, CLS, is a pre-K through 12 educational consulting organization based out of Phoenix, Arizona. We have over 14 years of serving as a thought partner for schools, districts and states, regional and county offices, helping to develop school climate guidelines and accountability systems that create safer, more supportive, and thriving learning environments. Now I'd like to introduce our 3 presenters for today, Dr. John Eiler, Manya Paul, and Ricky Shanklin. Manya is an educational consultant with CLS. She has experience as a school psychologist, a general education teacher, and a special ed teacher. Ricky is the director of counseling services as well as an educational consultant with CLS. She has experience as a principal, mentor, assistant principal, math director, and math teacher. John is the founder and CEO of Collaborative Learning Solutions. He brings experience as a teacher at the secondary level, a leader at the district and regional levels, and an instructor in higher education. Since 2009, he has also served as a technical assistant, providing for the California Department of Education, supporting LEAs that have been identified as significantly disproportionate. Now I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Ricky. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Dawn. So hello, everybody. Welcome to our webinar. As Dawn already mentioned, I'm Ricky, and I'm joined by Manya Paul and Dr. John Eiler. Whether you're with us in real time or watching the recording, thank you for taking the time to be here with us today. We know how busy everybody is. So please feel free to put your questions or comments in the chat, and we'll address them throughout the webinar. To reiterate a little bit about what Dawn shared about our company, we partner with districts and schools to develop systems that create safer, more equitable, and supportive learning environments. Our services primarily fall within the culture and climate space. Our team members are experienced educators who are passionate about advocating for and empowering students in the margins. That's what drives us every day. The next slide shows that our high leverage drivers for our work. We believe in developing systems that are sustainable and have integration and coherence among all educational partners, initiatives, and practices to ensure there's equity and access for all. And now I'm going to hand it over to Dr. John Eiler, who's going to talk a little bit about systems design.
Awesome. Thanks, Ricky. I always like to start with this quote. The way we design our systems and structures drives the way people think, behave, and problem solve within those structures. And one of the things we've noticed over the past 14, 15 years is that these tiered systems of support, whether it's RTI or PBIS or MTSS, tend to be vertically implemented and solely at a school level. And so what happens is, a district says, we want to implement PBIS. And so they hire someone or they build internal capacity, and then they go on a training mission and they go implement at each of the schools. And one of the challenges is a lot of those implementation considerations don't take into account the fact that there's a lot of horizontal structures that need to be developed and integrated across support structures. And that is primarily done at the district level. And so what you'll be hearing about today are some of the district level horizontal implementation considerations for you to think about. To do that, we developed a framework. So several years ago, we had our consulting team sift through every possible fidelity tool that we could find, any guidance around culture climate rather, and really came up with a framework. And so you'll be hearing a little bit about that today. There are some parts of the framework that we're going to highlight, but a framework essentially is just a tool to help us organize thoughts and ideas. And so I would equate this to like a 5,000 piece puzzle, right? If you didn't have the picture, it would drive you nuts. The picture is the framework. It's something that we can take a piece of the puzzle, figure out where it might go within the framework or within the picture, and make it make sense for whoever looks at that puzzle or that picture. And so Ricky's going to share with us a little bit about kind of the journey along that framework, and then you'll be hearing specifically about some of the elements of it.
Thanks, John. So where does this framework come from? So several years ago, our consultants got together and looked at some of these, as you'll see on this slide, these are the key influences behind what we call our integrated framework for improvement. And we're going to be sharing that with you. But it's built on multiple research-based theories and includes A Nation at Hope. That was written by the Aspen Institute, which is a national commission on social, emotional, and academic development. It was released in 2019 as a response to the 30-year anniversary of A Nation at Risk. The report summarized 30 years of research and practice, and it added in student and family voice, which was missing in A Nation at Risk. And it created a hopeful testimonial of the opportunities that lie in front of us through systematic change. And this is what our framework is highly based on. So many of us, sorry. So based on this research, these three categories, we found that these three categories provide the fundamentals to ensure the sustainability of a district's implementation of an integrated and equitable framework for improvement. So I'm going to go through each of them. So foundations. Foundations are a district's purpose and alignment of values and goals, which is demonstrated through the research-based practices to ensure conditions for learning are provided by all students. Common assurances are the resources and practices we prioritize, budget for, train to, coach, and measure for sustainability to ensure that every student's receiving an equitable education. And partnerships, of course, are ensuring all educational partners are included in and have a voice in decision-making. And what you're looking at here, those categories are all along the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side are, this is our framework. On the right-hand side of our framework, we have some key deliverables. That's the far right column. So we're going to highlight several of these throughout our time together. So we're going to focus on common definitions, common teaming structures, alignment of personnel, and communication plan. So we work through these deliverables with teams using a very basic process: learn, explore, and build. So we work with teams to build collective and foundational understanding first of an integrated tiered support system and what that means, what that looks like. They take the time to explore deliverables from other districts across the country. And then they go ahead and they build their own, because each district has their own unique needs. So we're going to start off with Manya. She's going to start us off with talking about common definitions, our first deliverable.
Thank you, Ricky. So when we go through this process with our districts and supporting them and building their framework, we make this a very interactive and community building process. We want to make sure that the people who have come from all over the district, which we'll talk a little bit more about later, have a chance to really have some skin in the game, shall we say. We want to make sure that there's buy-in and that they've had a chance to fully participate in the development of the process. We don't want to just come in and say, okay, here are the definitions. This is what you have to do. We want to make sure that it's personalized specifically for the district. So we're encouraging you, if you're working through this process with your district, to take that into account to make sure your definitions match your district's needs. So this is a sample activity of what we do as we go through building our framework processes. We give the groups a number of definitions to look at that came from other districts that have already built theirs out or came from research-based organizations or such, giving them a chance to really go through and looking at what are the key points, what's important, what resonates with our school community, our district community, and what fits in that we need to make sure we are explicitly defining within our process. We have them work in small groups. They draft out their definitions, and then we come back together and we talk about what each group came up with definitions. You'd be surprised, maybe. Sometimes they have a lot in common. Sometimes they came up with the same things, and other times it's very different. So it really builds a beautiful conversation around why which element is important and where to proceed from there. After coming to some conclusion on our definitions, and here's an example, and I know that's a little bit small, but we'll zoom in on one in a minute. We have them build an overarching definition of what a multi-tiered system of support. That's a place where you're going to put information like culturally responsive, includes all students. Any of those specifics that apply to every single tier, instead of repeating it over and over and over again, we want to encompass that into that main definition and then break down within each of the tiers some of the specificity. With the example we have on the screen, and you might be able to see the percentages on there, there are pieces then that they can build out from this. So, for example, this says the impact of good first teaching in Tier 1 should result in approximately 80 to 85% of students achieving mastery at grade level or making adequate growth on their core instruction. And then it breaks it down into some more specifics to this particular district on what that's going to look like and how are they going to monitor that. They repeat the same thing with Tier 2s and Tier 2 and Tier 3. Take a little bit closer look at the Tier 2. So they're specific, they're detailed, they give quick bullet points, but they're not paragraph after paragraph that somebody needs to go back to try to sort out what does this actually mean. I'm sure if I asked you to raise your hand virtually on how much misconception and how much misunderstanding exists in your school sites around this, everyone would be like, there's a lot. Everybody defines it differently. Some people say Tier 3 is special education. Some people say no, it's not special education, by the way. But there are those commonalities that you will see among districts and misunderstandings that we want to help unify by going through this process. You can see with this Tier 2 example, it talks explicitly. This is support provided in addition to, not in lieu of, what a student is receiving at the Tier 1 level of instruction. One thing I did want to point out, I think we didn't say, is certainly if you have questions as we're moving through this, please feel free to put them in the chat. Dawn will help us notice if we're missing those questions. We don't want you to just save everything for the end and get lost in the process with it. Going a little bit deeper into our Tier 2 example and looking at that, this is one that often is discrepant, shall we say, within districts. Some districts will say, well, Tier 2 is really all about the targeted instruction. This is a PLC, a professional learning community driven process, and it's all about the mastery of grade level content. It's going to be handled within the classroom. Maybe we'll have some push in for some intervention from some intervention personnel, and it's all about focusing on those core instructional materials. Now, in other districts, and we're not saying there's a right or wrong here, just giving you an example. In other districts, it's focused more on that targeted intervention. So I'll use an example. A district I was in, our Tier 2 for reading often fell in that targeted intervention piece. So we had the reading specialist pulling out students who who are at risk in their reading skills and was going back and working on mastery of those foundational skills. That was done as a supplement to the core instruction within that. Neither way is necessarily right or wrong. You need to decide what works best for your district. And maybe it's a blend of the two, but then have it defined so that you know exactly how you're going to proceed through, because having that process mapped out is one of the most important pieces within that. Now, once you've done all that work, which I've covered in 3 minutes or less, but actually can take many hours to do, but it's worthwhile time because you are going to really use a consensus model before you're done with all of these definitions. Again, referring back to the comment about the importance of having that buy-in. The people who are building these definitions are your ambassadors, are the ones that are helping to support the process out throughout the district. It's important to really do a consensus. Don't do a majority says. Take the time to delve in and look at where there might be disagreement or where there might be opposition on specific elements of what you're defining. We've got a couple different methods here. We've got the thumbs up, thumbs sideways, thumbs down. We have the 5 fingers and the fist. You can see some of those pieces of what that's there. But we want to make sure is any of those pieces where there are problems are dealt with, resolved, and you're moving forward straight from this point here. And if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. And we will move on to building your teams. And Ricky's going to talk to you about that.
So similarly, so building your teams, starting to talk about the teams that you have represented across your district is actually going to be a much better, more enriched conversation and more profitable, I guess, in the end, beneficial in the end, when you have such a solid understanding, common understanding of your tiers and your definitions of your tiers prior to that work. So so they're very much connected, which I'm sure that you see that. But so one of our deliverables is designing teaming structures, common teaming structures. And so typically in existing tiered systems, we often find teams talking about individual kids. So John kind of talked a little bit about this, but not looking at a child as a whole. For example, a student's referred for behavior to PBIS team or behavior team, and that same student's also discussed by a separate team for academic support, instead of addressing the needs of the student through one integrated team. So our goal is to have an integrated approach that has staff of varied expertise on the same teams. So one child's looked at from all perspectives versus having multiple teams looking at the same student. So we actually start this process by completing an inventory of teaming structures. So what teaming structures do you already have across your district? And we do that by saying, okay, we first start off and let's list all the teams that you have. We primarily focus on the site teams. So what different site teams across your district do you have? So then we want to talk about and kind of note what's the purpose of each team, the people or positions that sit on each team, the respective tier or tiers that the team supports, and the unit of observation of each team. And so the unit of observation of each team is important. What that means is it's the team's purview. So like, is a team looking at the whole school? Is it looking at a grade level? Is it looking at classrooms, groups of students, individual students? So what is that team's purview? So when we do this and we go through this process, what we typically find is that there's a lot of overlapping areas and there's gaps that lead to a less efficient and less sustainable system. So so once we kind of go through that inventory, then teams can start discussing, okay, what do we want our teaming structures to look like? This is what we have. This is where we're overlapping. This is where our gaps are. What do we want this to look like? And sometimes it may look a little bit, if you're a district that is across levels. So if you're not just a high school district, you're not just an elementary district, it could look a little bit different across those levels. And those are things that need to be discussed and decided on. So this is a sample of this deliverable. So a district team establishing their team structures. So when you get this, there'll be a link to it that you can see. So it includes each of the teams, under each tier, and then who sits on the team's function, which is really important. So that's dependent on really going back and looking at your definitions too. The frequency of the team meetings and the data that's utilized by the team. So that's teaming structures in 2 minutes. So John's now going to take us through talking about alignment and utilization of personnel, which is no small task.
Yeah, thanks, Ricky. I think this is one of the pieces that is often overlooked in the implementation of any type of a tiered system. And just given the past 14 years that we've been in existence, we've seen different waves of a lot of like federal monies that were pushed into education. So ESSER, kind of our most recent example, we're in the days of ARA funds where they were pushed in to kind of stimulate our economy, and education was the beneficiary of receiving a lot of funds kind of all at once. And so what do districts do with those monies? Well, we typically invest in people to work directly with kids. And so we saw a lot of new positions. We saw greater complexity in education. There are positions now that never existed 10 years ago, 15 years ago. So directors of MTSS or coordinators of MTSS. We see directors of diversity, equity, inclusion that are sitting right now. We see directors of school improvement. There's just a whole different set of complexities. And so what districts often do is they'll reallocate those monies directly to school sites, and school sites will then make decisions on hiring people to fit the needs of their school, which makes complete sense. The challenge with this is that there is often a lot of ambiguity and confusion with regard to how people are utilized within an MTSS structure or an integrated framework. Let me just give you one example. So you're a sitting principal at a school site. You have a reading specialist and a behavior specialist or behavior intervention specialist. You've got a school counselor, you've got a school psychologist, and you have a social worker. And you're in a district of 50 schools. Most implementations don't do a whole lot of horizontal integration in terms of how those positions should function within the MTSS system. So that falls on the shoulders of the principal to figure out how to integrate all of those people into that system at that school site. So what happens is you have 50 different iterations of integration, and you have social workers that, maybe have a different job function at school A than they do at school B, and it just becomes a real mess, if you will. There's a lot of inefficiencies. The other challenge to this is sometimes districts will say, we are going to hire people that are maintained at the district level and deploy them to support schools. Well, if it's a district social worker and a school social worker, same job position, different expectations, different supervisors. There's just a lot of like role confusion. And so what this is in terms of utilization of personnel is first kind of taking inventory. Who do you have who are direct service, boots on the ground, providers to kids? And then we use kind of a big spreadsheet, if you will, to just start this. The second question we ask is, are these employees of the district or are they contracted? I was working with a system last year where the large majority of their support providers to kids were contracted relationships. They were vendoring out a lot of their mental health services. That's really, really tough for a school district to maintain integrity, if you will, and fidelity when everything is outsourced. It's hard to say, well, what are our 5 research-based or evidence-based, interventions that we're utilizing? How are we seeing effectiveness? They don't have supervision over these people, and they don't have capacity building responsibilities over these people. So those are some considerations: site funded versus district funded. Who is responsible for overseeing these people, and who is responsible for building their capacity? These are questions that come up, and they're often gaps. They're things we don't necessarily think about. I think as a principal, sometimes it's like, well, I don't know how to integrate all these people. So you're a social worker, do your social worker thing, like on my campus. And you're a school counselor, do your school counselor thing on my campus. And a lot of these newer positions that are coming in from like a clinical model of mental health think that we can just take a clinical model and layer it onto education. It doesn't always fit. And so there is a need to do some role clarity around how does a social worker function within our education system, within this district, and then now within the school. So these are some considerations that we kind of dive into when we take a look at utilization of personnel. The last piece on there is, I think this is really helpful when you're looking at readiness. It's going to kind of connect to what I'm going to talk about in a minute around implementation. But if you're looking at a larger district, say 50 schools, like the example I gave earlier, tier 2, tier 3 readiness there could be some common assurances that the district makes that says we're going to ensure that there is a reading intervention specialist across every elementary school, right? Regardless of how big or small you are, we're going to make sure that you have a reading intervention specialist. The school then may hire their own reading intervention specialists because they want additional supports, right? And so when we're looking at tier 2 and tier 3 readiness, part of this strategy is to look at what are the district allocated and funded resources and what are the school site funded. So collectively, we can say, okay, we've got 3.5 FTEs that are able to serve in a tier 2 and a tier 3 capacity. When we look at the size of the school and consider either 10 to 15% of the population that might be needing those services, we can then start to evaluate, is that FTE allocation enough to be able to serve the potential groups of kids, 10 to 15% that would show up in that, as in terms of needing that type of an intervention. So doing some type of a review, a survey, if you will, of your personnel is huge, and it will show some of these gaps and opportunities for us to create more clarity and integrate a little bit more. The last thing I would say on there is this is something that a district I'm working with right now is going through. School psychologist, social worker, school counselor, those 3 positions specifically can serve. And when you look at kind of the model of how those positions should serve in MTSS, all of them have responsibilities in tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. And if we're not clear about how those people function in this system, then there's a lot of confusion about, well, who's running small groups? And well, I don't have capacity to do that. So I'm going to send it over to you, Manya, because I know you can do this according to your, role, and you should be doing it, but I don't have capacity. So being able to create role clarity around, for school psychologists in this system, this is how we want them to function primarily within the MTSS structure. It's important to create just understanding and common understanding and clarity. I'm going to move into talking a little bit about some implementation considerations. We can move to the next slide on there. If you aren't familiar with this, the National Implementation Research Network, which is a group that has put out most or majority of their research around implementation, and a lot of tiered systems rely on kind of the research of this group. It's kind of out of UNC, North Carolina, I believe. They propose that implementation really occurs in 4 stages: exploration, installation, initial implementation, and full implementation. And I think it's important for us to consider what are the exploration activities that need to occur before we can move to an installation. Installation is really the building phase. Do we have the right protocols? Do we have definitions, for example? Do we have clarity around teaming structures? What are they? What are their functions? Who sits on them? How often do they meet? Those are all installation activities. So a lot of what Ricky shared in that framework, the deliverables on the far right-hand side in orange, those are installation activities for the most part for a school district to create a plumb line that then schools can start to align with. Part of the reason we do that at a district level is when you look at the seat of the principal, it's roughly around 15% or so. It changes, every year nationally, but it's about roughly 15% of principals change seats every year. And so when you're looking at mobility upwards, or that move a lateral position, they take another position or job assignment somewhere else, go back to the classroom, there's a lot of mobility and change within school site administration. And so to have, an implementation of a tiered system that doesn't have a district plumb line is really, really tough to maintain sustainability long-term, because the sole capacity for making that engine run, if you will, is only at the site level. And so what we would encourage districts to do is consider these stages of implementation at a district level first to create a plumb line, which then supports schools in aligning to those structures. If we can move to the next slide, and we can use the chat for this. I'm going to ask you to consider units of implementation, or we might even say units of observation. Ricky referred to this earlier when we consider teaming structures. But if I was to ask you to look at units of implementation, how many units would you say are represented here? So I did this to kind of represent elementary schools in orange, middle schools in yellow, high schools in dark blue, and then gray representing alternative schools. Use the chat for a second, just put the number of units that you would see here if we were considering implementation. I'm not seeing any go through. I'm not sure what's going on. There's 12. Thank you, Diane. 4. Okay. All right. Not seeing anyone else jump in there. 5. Seeing a little bit different. Yeah. So units of implementation is basically what is the area, what is the structure that we're looking at implementing this tiered system of support, if you will. We can look at it from a school site perspective. If we say the unit of implementation is all elementaries, we're talking about 5 elementary schools given this model. If our unit of implementation is high schools, we're talking about 2. I think most people would look at this and say, okay, we're going to implement MTSS. There's 11 different schools in our district, and so we're going to have 11, different units, if you will, or implementation. And I think, Diane, I would agree with you that really there's the 12th. And we would encourage districts to really start with the blue that encompasses the schools, because that is your support mechanism and your sustainability mechanism long-term. It's also your mechanism for integration. And so when we look at implementation, we can go to the next slide. There's really considerations that each of these units needs to go through their own 4 stages. So a district needs to go through all 4 stages. Each school site needs to go through their 4 stages. So the consideration of a phased model or a cohort model, if you will, is something that we encourage larger systems to consider, because it gives time for schools in phase 2 or cohort 2 to begin with some of those exploration and installation activities. It's the readiness, the tilling of the soil before they actually put those structures into practice and into motion at the school site. So this is an example of a district I'm working with right now that they're going to do between 10 and 15 phase 1 sites. Their exploration was last year, and their installation this is a school or a site-based implementation strategy. Their installation or their structural implementation is this year. So what they're doing is there's a whole list of activities. They're making sure that they have time that's allocated within their master schedule for next year, so that they can ensure that they have intervention slots and times that are available. They're doing the utilization of personnel. How many FTEs do they have available that are both district funded and site funded for next year? They're doing their common assurances. What are their tier 1 interventions that they're going to be using for next year? Do they have all the materials for people to engage in that? Do they have the processes? Have they done the work with staff? Is there a common understanding around how kids access these? Those are all installation activities. Initial implementation will begin next year, where they actually start to hit the gas pedal a little bit and that vehicle starts to move. So while they're doing that, there's a whole nother group of 30 or so schools that are going to be engaging in exploration activities this year, creating common understanding, calibrating understanding of MTSS. There's a lot of different interpretations of tier 2. That's the most ambiguous space. I think Amanya shared a little bit of that, but it's creating a common understanding for this particular system, what that means. All right, I think we're going to move on to the next. Manya, you're going to move into communication a little bit to kind of round us out with our last element.
Yes, I will. And before I start talking about communication, I actually want to take a step backwards. And as we were going through this, I thought, we didn't clarify that point. When we're talking about this implementation and building this framework, we didn't explicitly share with you who should be involved in that. And when we're looking at a district level process, we want to make sure that all groups are represented. You want to make sure that you have the inclusion of your bargaining units, that you have district level administrators, site level administrators, very importantly, your teaching staff, your school psychologists, your mental health staff, your interventionists, etc. Having samplings from all those groups, and this feeds into the communication we're about to talk about, really helps build that buy-in piece and helps make sure that you've had every single voice possible included. Maybe you don't need to include classified staff. It depends on what their role is in supporting students. And I do not say that lightly, because I think classified staff is the least celebrated staff member, but perhaps the most important staff member in any school district. We can't run our schools without our incredible classified staff. But in terms of building this process and how it's going to be followed through and implemented, having that really robust group together to debate everything and to create the system that fits the school's culture is going to be very important. So that feeds directly into actually my communication points. So as you're going through this process, part of your communication is happening with the group that you're working with, right? They're hearing this at the exact moment as it's being developed. But you need to also think about, where does that thoughtful communication come into play? We all know how rumors work, right? Oh, I heard they're doing this and they're going to get rid of XYZ and they're going to make us do ABC, and the rumors start. So right from the beginning, as you are working with your design team, your implementation team, whatever you're going to call the group you're working with, you need to be thoughtful and on target with what your communication is going to look like. Who do we need to communicate to? How and when and what is the communication need to be? Using an organizing document, making sure we're focusing on the message and that message is consistent across groups. At the same time, it may need to be different. You need to be thinking about, what messaging do we give to parents or families versus what messaging do we give to teachers or administrators. We need to think about, what's that timeline for it. You don't want to save all the communication for the very end. That doesn't give anybody time to process it, and also lead to that feeling of one more top-down process. District saying we have to do this, and we don't have any opportunity to engage in understanding or knowing how this process is being built. So you're thinking about who needs to be included. I've touched on this, but making sure your superintendent has been kept in the loop, of course, and cabinet. Your school board, because they may be involved. You saw in the chart that Ricky shared, if there needs to be any changes to board policy or such, we want to make sure that the school board is kept in the loop. Very, very importantly, your bargaining units and their leadership. There's a district I'm working with right now where we have on our design team presidents of both the classified staff and certified staff. And it has been very important to have their voice, their buy-in, and their partnership in this process to help us build towards that successful rollout when we're ready to start that installation and implementation phase. And of course, teachers and the support personnel that go with them. They are the ones who are seeing what is happening. And we need to make sure that we keep them as part in that communication, again, to avoid some of the pitfalls I touched on. Your school leadership, your district leadership, and of course, keep your classified personnel in the loop. But don't forget your families and community. They are an integral part of any type of MTSS process. As we all know, we're not going to make progress with our students if we have not included the family within it. So I touched on this, but be explicit and be decisive on how, when, and what information should be shared with each group. Don't leave it to chance. Be thoughtful about it. Use a tool such as this. Have a grid. Okay, what's the message that the superintendent is going to receive? What information are we giving the superintendent? What information do we want the superintendent to give? What messaging needs to come from that level back out to the school community? How are they going to do it? Are they doing meetings? Are they doing a newsletter? Are they doing an audio recording? When is it happening, and who is responsible for making sure that this is incorporated in there? The same pieces go down the line. And in saying give, what messaging do we want them to give? We want teachers and support personnel, of course, to give a unified message, particularly back to families and parents, to see that they are working together as a unit within the district, that the community is working as one within that. Here's a little bit of an example of what a partially filled out communication plan can look like. Some of the messaging that we would be giving to the superintendent, questions, things that maybe we want to ask back to her or him, and to see where they have connection with that. So some of the very important points to consider, and this falls in line not just with your communication, but through all of your work of building this process, is what are the existing district initiatives that align with the MTSS work? I'm sure that you can all think of 15 different things that are happening, perhaps in isolation within your districts, that really are all part of an MTSS process. But maybe they're not seen within the framework, maybe they're not labeled as such, and it is important to be thinking about what are they, identifying them, and how do you incorporate them back into the communication. Again, to reiterate, so that it's not feeling like one more thing is being dropped on, but being able to show the community we have pieces here, we're incorporating it in, and we're not telling you to throw out what you're doing necessarily. We're asking you perhaps to modify how it's being utilized, communicated, or assessed within the process. Don't be afraid to really think about what the potential roadblocks are, because we know, as I referenced, rumors start, and there are pieces that could be a challenge for you. Think about it, and think about what the misunderstandings are around MTSS. I remember working in a district, and PBIS was still fresh and new and exciting. And everybody's like, oh, they're bringing us one more curriculum we have to do. It's one more must do, and it's a thing, right? We're going to teach this curriculum, this PBIS, not understanding that it's a culture. It's not a thing that you do for 10 minutes a day. It's how you respond and react to every single behavior or work that a student does throughout any school day. That common misunderstanding falls within the MTSS realm also. I've had districts say to me, okay, well, MTSS is going to be right here, but over here next to MTSS, we are going to run this group, this committee, this referral process, whatever the case may be. And having to take them backwards and say, hold on, MTSS is the overall encompassing framework under which everything you are doing in the district falls, and bringing that back in together and seeing that there aren't things outside of it, but everything falls within it, and building that framework to see where that space is. So really addressing head on those misunderstandings that you might fall within there.
Manya, can I take a second just to add a little bit to that?
Absolutely.
I think your point of just the MTSS plus like the things that are happening, we see a lot of like multiple tiered systems operating kind of siloed in right next to each other. So RTI is more for like our academic systems. We've got PBIs for our behavioral systems. MTS in many districts is kind of taking the spot of their social emotional behavioral or their mental health tiered system, if you will. I think it's important to even consider whether or not you lead with MTSS. I think that some districts at this stage in the game have had a lot of false starts, or they've had a lot of unsuccessful starts with MTSS. And that is, the new shiny object. It's something that, oh, here's the new initiative. And so I would encourage you, this is our equity framework, or this is our whole child framework, or our improvement framework. Those are all completely fine. And that's actually part of the reason why we choose not to lead with MTSS. It's an integrated framework for improvement is what we internally call it, to really kind of push that message. So that is part of a consideration for communication, is what's the history around this in this district? And do we lead with that or do we not? Is there something else that we're already kind of bought into? One of the strategies that I think all three of us have probably used with districts is the use of like a tap in, tap out circle type of a structure to be able to engage people in this start of this conversation around communication. And one of the questions I like to ask in that is, what are some of the areas of resistance and hesitation around this system that we're working on right now? And it's nice in that format because it allows people to put things into the circle or surface things, not from a position of interest because that's the seat I sit in, or not from a position of power because that's the seat I sit in. It's more of just surfacing, here's some resistance and some things that need to be clarified. That's super helpful in crafting the messaging around your communication plan. And so being able to have kind of a free space where people can just throw things out, I think is a really healthy way to start this work of developing an intentional communication plan around this body of work.
Absolutely. Thank you, John, for that addition. Again, we welcome your questions. You can drop into the chat. We're very happy to answer them, engage in dialogue with you now. If you do not have time right now and you want to continue the conversation with us, please utilize the QR code. We'll be happy. Whoever's the most appropriate staff member will be happy to reach out to you directly to see how we can support within that.
So we do have one question.
Yep.
We are in this point of our site implementation of our timeline. Do you have tips on how to get staff buy-in?
Anybody want to jump in on that? I would say part of this this communication piece, you know, I'm going to date myself, okay? Anybody remember WIFM? What's in it for me? Okay, it's kind of an 80s, 90s term, so I'm definitely dating myself. I think for me, when I'm going into this and working with groups and trying to support them is really kind of simplifying things back down to that what's in it for me. We know staff today they're overwhelmed, they're concerned, they're like, I have to do one more thing. You want me to track what? You want me to do what? Is really giving them a chance to identify and see how this is going to be beneficial for them, for their students, giving them a chance to ask questions, express concerns, of course, having to be careful to not allow it just to become a complaint session, right? So that has to be carefully structured as you're doing it, but giving them a live opportunity to have a conversation around it. I don't, Ricky, John, you might want to add on to that.
Yeah, I think a lot of these, historically in education, we are very much about like having the right answers, and especially like if it's an elementary school, much more compliance oriented. People want to do the right thing. And I found that taking that off a little bit to say, this is kind of a framework for us to get better at improving. It's not about checking the boxes and doing this because this is the nice new shiny thing. It's a structure that allows us to problem solve better and to do better by kids. So it's about improvement, and we're going to make mistakes. We're going to try some things that don't work, and we're going to be open, honest, transparent about that. I think taking that stress off of like, I need to do A, B, and C all the time. It's more of the, okay, in this next phase, here are some things that we want to implement and try, and we want feedback on it. An approach like that, I think, is more in the with box, if you will. If you're talking about kind of restorative practices, it's not being done to the site or to teachers, it's in the with box that we have an obligation and a moral responsibility to do the best we can for kids. And this is a framework that will help all of us do that. And it's open and kind of ongoing in terms of improvement. So maybe that's a consideration for the way that it might be couched with staff and creating buy-in, if you will.
I agree. I think that one of the things that we keep when we're working with district teams, it keeps coming up like almost like that. When is the work done? And unfortunately, the work's never done because we're always learning and growing. And that's a part of the conversation. We're learning and growing together. We learn more, we do better. We and we figure it out together.
And Michelle, to follow up a little bit on your comment and having worked at a high school for many years and understanding some of those struggles that you're seeing there, and sometimes it is breaking it down for them also as you're doing the implementation. Okay, well, let's start with doing this, but not stopping there, right? Having that phased implementation and that phased rollout. Just, I mean, you're accommodating your staff just like you're accommodating your students. You're chunking the information, you're breaking it down. Maybe you're providing extended timelines. But those pieces, they're important to help gain their buy-in and for them to also feel I've been heard, understood, and yes, I want to do what's good for kids.
Shall I see your comment in there? And I would encourage you to follow up later. There's a link in there to reach out. I'd love to have a conversation with you. We've supported a high school only district in California that has 19 comprehensive high schools. And they've all engaged in exactly what you're where you're at right now. So I'd love to maybe connect you with even some of those principals to get some ideas on how they work through some of those buy-in strategies.
Certainly, we're love to hear more questions from you. If you don't want a direct contact, and I know Dawn put the link in the chat also, if you didn't grab the QR code, there are a number of ways to stay connected with us. Dawn does a great job of keeping us up to date on our different social media channels. There's a lot of informative information, shall I say, that's being shared out. So if you aren't already following us in your preferred channel, we encourage you to do so. Our website has a wealth of information, including a blog, free SEL tools, and a variety of other pieces of information that you may find interesting. We do have time for a few more questions if anybody has any. We really thank you for taking time out of your busy days to join us from a variety of different time zones today. We do run a regular series of webinars, so please stay in touch. You can find those on our LinkedIn. I'm not sure the next one is coming in March, I believe. Maybe Dawn can tell us when that is because I don't recall at the moment. The next one is March 24th. And you'll see advertisements, signups for it on our LinkedIn and in our newsletter. Thank you for attending. Everybody have a wonderful day.